Thanks for joining us for the Tennessee Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence live learning series. Today we're going to do the very last one in this series on visualization and communication. So I will hand it over to Mugdha today. Like I said, this is the last session, and I think we're only scheduled for like an hour, and we'll have some discussion at the end if we have time. Thanks, Mugdha.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. We're going to be talking today about data visualization and communication, mostly focusing on WGS results, but also some general, some things that are applicable to clusters in general or outbreaks in general. So I think I see some familiar names on the call, but for folks who don't know me, my name is Mugdha Golwalkar. I'm an epidemiologist and our outbreak coordinator at the Tennessee Department of Health in our foodborne and enteric diseases program. So again, most of this content will focus on enterics and on foodborne and enteric outbreaks, but we have some resources for folks who also do AMD work with other pathogens that Lauren will sprinkle in the chat throughout. And there's my email address if you would like to contact me. So our main learning objectives for the session will be to talk about the impact versus investment of routine use of data visualization tools. I know we're in a little bit of an interesting funding landscape, and so there's different programs and platforms that may be of value to you. And then just being able to recognize how data visualization can support cluster and outbreak investigations and be able and help you, save time in some of these detection and investigation efforts. We'll talk about how to communicate WGS results and interpret some standard phrasing that we can use, as well as summarize complex lab testing and genetic comparisons for a more general audience. And then we'll also go through PulseNet 2.0 really quickly and how epidemiologists can obtain access and why they might want to. We'll start with some data visualization. I probably I'm preaching to the choir here, but there is, significant value in data visualization. We collect a lot of data through our interviews, through, whole genome sequencing, through our outbreak investigations. All of this data has to, help us inform both outbreak decisions and also future funding, which is more important than ever. So data visualization has value in that it can really help us easily identify similarities and differences quickly between cases in an outbreak, between isolates that have been sequenced, and be able to take meaningful action. It can help track processes more efficiently. Things that maybe you were previously tracking on a spreadsheet could be moved over to a visualization platform for more ready to be a little bit easier to navigate. And then it can help describe trends and gaps, which is, I think, what we see most often with, public-facing dashboards and things like that. So some of the impact, I already kind of talked about, but for outbreaks in particular, it can really, really help make communication with partners clearer. A lot of people are visual learners, or it helps them understand concepts to have a visual aid as you're explaining something complicated to them. It can reduce the time it takes to investigate and reduce some of the manual process, which I'll talk about an example of that later. And then it can simplify some of our monitoring and grant reporting and evaluation activities by synthesizing the data in a dynamic and more readily accessible way. The flip side of that, the investment side, is obviously there can be significant challenges in agency buy-in and license costs. Tennessee has historically primarily used Tableau for our data visualization, but we are in the same boat as many states where we may be we have to decrease the number of Tableau licenses we can have, and maybe exploring other options like Power BI or R or other things that are out there. If anyone uses something that they've had a really good experience with that has been cost effective and that they've been able to get leadership buy-in for, please feel free to put it in the chat. I think that people would appreciate knowing what other options might be out there. Same with, we use SAS primarily for a lot of our data analysis, but also have a lot of R users. And so, maybe needing to switch to something more cost effective like R in the future. A big part of the investment to think about too, not just the license cost, is the time that it takes to build sufficient expertise for the person creating visualizations. When you're talking about a WGS visualization platform, whether it's PulseNet 2.0 or something like Microbe Trace, there is a pretty significant learning curve if you are not a trained bioinformatician. So, and perhaps even if you are. So, making sure that when you are considering different options for how to visualize your data, that you are also factoring in the time required to build expertise, or what expertise you already have, maybe that you can leverage, and whether your data is sufficiently interoperable to be able to work with that platform. And then the last thing here is building end user data literacy and technical skills. So, we can build all kinds of dendrograms and dashboards and whatever we need, but it's not helpful to everyone unless people know how to accurately interpret that data. And building that end user data literacy, and even sometimes making sure those people have access to the visualizations, can be a real investment that doesn't always get considered upfront. So the first example of some of the visualization tools that are out there and available are different tools for creating dendrograms, matrices, different types of trees for whole genome sequencing visualization. Both of the examples that I have on the screen here come from the PulseNet 2.0 platform. So these should look familiar to a lot of you, and perhaps you are using this type of data pretty regularly for cluster detection and evaluation. So, as you can see on the left side of the screen, we have our kind of standard dendrogram. This is an allele-based dendrogram, but we talked about NCEI last session, and that uses SNPs. So you can see the difference between alleles and SNPs if you compare the same isolates between those two platforms. PulseNet 2.0 can also produce a heat matrix, which can be helpful for quickly visually identifying a cluster, and sometimes even can be a little bit easier to look at and interpret than even the dendrogram. So if you are currently getting these from your laboratory, but you don't get a heat map, they're very easy to generate in the platform, and so it might be something to consider requesting from your lab. And then, I mentioned that there's other platforms out there that can do different types of sequencing data visualizations. Some of those are linked in the chat. Thanks, Lauren. They include like Microbe Trace, NextStrain, MicroReact. Some of these are free, some are not. And then I'm sure there are probably many other platforms that exist that I'm not aware of or particularly familiar with. I think for Enterix, we benefit a lot from having this kind of standardized platform with PulseNet 2.0, but for folks who work on HIV or STIs, you may be familiar with Microbe Trace. HAIs, you might be familiar with some of these other products. One of the things that we have used data visualization of our WGS data for is to create this allele code dashboard. So I know Jack talked about rep strains some in our last session, and I'm not going to ask you to think back that far, but one of the ways that we've been able to kind of track those strains within Tennessee is to visualize our allele codes and kind of keep track of them. Now, this is a little bit old, so I know that the allele codes have changed, and it actually doesn't, really matter for the purposes of this presentation which one is the top allele code in here, but visualizing our allele codes is a way, assuming that they don't change 300,000 times, is a way that we are hoping to continue to be able to track some of these repeating or emerging strains in Tennessee, and can be a good way to, to kind of localize your data, so that it's not, just everything that's in Centric. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but, and this is more related to cluster detection than whole genome sequencing data, but one of the ways that we have started to supplement some of our cluster detection is by using SATscan. SATscan's a free software if folks are not aware of that. It is, oh gosh, I cannot remember exactly who the developer is now, but a number of states, including New York City, use it for cluster detection based on just case data. There is a little bit of a learning curve, but it can give you both kind of a epi curve style, increase in cases notification, as well as a mapped cluster, geographical clusters with the level of significance noted in that graph. So if you look at the bottom, it's a little bit small to read, but you can see that there's a p-value for cluster 1 in the bottom left corner generated that is 0.056, and the recurrence interval is 125 days, which means that the likelihood that you would see that many cases based on historical data in that time frame is very low. So this is an option for folks who may be using more costly GIS platforms and are needing to perhaps switch to something that is freely available. Oh, thank you to Brian for putting the developer, Martin Koldorf, in the chat. Appreciate it. But I will say there is a little bit of a learning curve here. There are some great resources that folks have developed to help with that. And our team is certainly willing to share what we've been doing so far if you are interested in this as a data visualization option. And then, in terms of monitoring or tracking, whether certain things are complete, we capture a lot of data and have a number of things that need to be reported for various metrics and for, closeout, for reconciliation with CDC. So some of these dashboards are ways that we have been able to quickly identify areas where data might be missing, reconcile between different systems that we use that capture some of the same data, to make sure that we have consistent and complete information across different systems. And it can also be a way to track performance. If you've got student interviewers, for example, we have a performance dashboard for like completeness and kind of consistency of completing interviews. All right, quick knowledge check. I think, Lauren, if you could put the poll up. Which of the following is not a challenge in cluster or WGS data visualization? Ability for users to access visualizations, rapidly detecting commonalities, software security and cost, and interpreting the data accurately. We've got like 40% responding. I'll give it another few seconds. All right, last chance to pick an answer in the poll. Okay, so we had a pretty good mix of results. The correct response is B, rapidly detecting commonalities. It is difficult sometimes for users to access visualizations, particularly in license-based platforms. You may need to get people access to a public-facing server to be able to access it. They may need their own license to be able to access visualizations, particularly dynamic visualizations, or you may have to generate kind of static visualizations repeatedly in order to give people access. So that can definitely be a challenge in terms of some of this type of visualization. But being able to rapidly detect commonalities is one of the main benefits. Oh, sorry, Lauren, I didn't mean to do that. Okay. So last time we talked about Salmonella I4I outbreak. I think very briefly. I don't know if folks remember it, so I'm just going to give you a little tiny bit of background. On October 15th, 2024, this is what our cluster report looks like. I know it's a little hard to see this little dendrogram on the side, but we first identified this cluster of 2 cases of Salmonella I4I minus in people in the same county in Tennessee with pretty close onset dates to each other and 0 alleles apart by core genome MLST, by whole genome sequencing. So that straight line means 0 alleles difference. Unfortunately, initially, one of those cases was lost to follow-up, so we didn't end up doing any additional investigation. But then later in December, this cluster kind of popped back up. As a cluster of 3 different cases that were also 0 alleles apart, that also from that same county and had that same allele code. So at this point in the investigation of this cluster, we looked in NCBI, found this nice tree, realized that it was the same cluster as those previous cases from October, and were able to kind of use a combination of those visualizations to open a larger outbreak investigation. Then I mentioned earlier, one of the ways that we can use the visualizations is to decrease the time that it takes us to do certain manual tasks. And one of the manual tasks that we often have to kind of go into each case interview and review is exposures for when people are part of a WGS cluster. So we've recently, I say we, but mostly Jack on our team, recently created this Tableau dashboard where we can, select by cluster, and it'll show you how many cases in that cluster report a particular exposure or exposure category from their initial interview. So you can see there's, meat exposures, animal exposures, travel, kind of the big things that we would look for commonalities with. And then, you can, in this case, in this outbreak, we had some, kind of maybe more than normal beef, egg, and chicken exposures, which was kind of interesting. And then you can also in this dashboard drill down to particular exposures to look at particular details. So in this case, unfortunately, the beef, egg, and chicken drill down did not yield very helpful details. But when we drilled down on restaurants, and I've changed names for our purposes, but when you drilled down on restaurants in our dashboard, you could see that there was a common restaurant identified between a handful of those cases. And you can see that pretty quickly and readily in this dashboard. So it's been a really helpful way to reduce the time it takes to manually review cluster exposures. And it's something that we can keep kind of dynamically and update on a regular basis. So it would update when we have new cases. And then, so for this outbreak, we then did all of the environmental work and we're able to do some environmental sampling at this restaurant, and we're able to find salmonella on an environmental sample. And so this is kind of what our final dendrogram for the outbreak looked like. On this left-hand side column closest to the dendrogram, that is the state that the case was from. And then there's another state column, which is which lab tested it. So that's why there's two state columns and some discrepancies. But you can see that our cluster of cases was 0 alleles apart, with our one environmental isolate being 1 allele apart from our outbreak cases. So still pretty clearly clustering together. And then the next closest kind of cluster in the PulseNet database was 9 alleles apart. So still I4I minus, possibly its own outbreak, maybe from 2022, but far enough to be pretty clear that they weren't the same outbreak. And then, in that other clade that was 9 alleles away, or that other group that was 9 alleles away, there were also 2 kind of groups in there that were 6 alleles apart themselves. So sometimes, that can be enough on its own to give you a sense of, yes, this is clearly clustering together, indicating a common source, and not related maybe to these other things. We also visualize this as a matrix. So our outbreak is down in the right corner in the red square. And you can see this maybe is a little bit easier to tell that they are, different meaningfully from that other kind of 2022 Arkansas cluster. So this combination of visualizations really helped us be able to visualize a bunch of different types of data, both our WGS data as well as our cluster and epi data for this outbreak. So, a combination of tools can be really useful in both saving time and effort in some of these investigations. And I know I mentioned that both of those, the dendrogram and that matrix, came from PulseNet 2.0. So I want to take a second to highlight some of the benefits of using PulseNet 2.0. I'm sure that, I know we have some lab folks on the call. If anyone has any comments about PulseNet 2.0 from the lab, or from folks who do create dendrograms or matrices about why they're beneficial, please feel free to put them in the chat. In Tennessee, we have our EPIs have access to PulseNet 2.0, and so our EPI team is able to generate our weekly cluster report and our dendrograms, and has found this to be really beneficial for a number of different reasons. So when compared to Cedric, PulseNet 2.0 can create dendrograms and matrices. It doesn't have its full data visualization tools built in yet. There are still some data visualization tools coming in PulseNet 2.0. I don't know exactly what all of them will be, but there will be some that are added. But even just having those dendrograms and matrices available is really helpful. We're able to see all of the isolates and clusters at once, and can more easily drill further back in time if we need to on specific clusters. We can find Shigella clusters and Campylobacter clusters other than Jejuni because it's not reliant on allele codes. And then we can see pretty readily and quickly when a new isolate is added to a cluster. Additionally, epi access in Tennessee has really allowed us to workload share and with our laboratory. So in times where they've had, they've had a lot of turnover or we've had a lot of turnover, we've been able to support each other by taking, having the epi side sort of take this responsibility on when we can. And that's made, that's made a big difference in being able to have that workload sharing. It also having epi access and epis creating the dendrograms can help streamline synthesis with some of the epi and clinical data that you have. So for example, from week to week, it's just a little bit easier to tell, oh yeah, I already looked at this cluster. We know that this is, from a household or something like that. So it's a little bit easier to be internally consistent with EPIs who have the interview data, reviewing and delineating the clusters. It also lets EPIs more quickly determine when EPI data supports expanding the time range to look further back in time on a cluster. It can help weed out some of those clusters you don't want to investigate really. And then track clusters like those rep strains or clusters that might close and reopen frequently, like Listeria. The steps to get access, mainly you want to ask a laboratorian that has access to email PulseNet and request read-only certification for you as an EPI. You will need to have SAMS access, and they will give you access to the PulseNet SharePoint if you don't already have it. In order to access PulseNet 2.0. There's also some, data use forms and things that you'll have to complete. You do have to pass a quick quiz. There is a lovely user guide. It's very well put together and a test environment that CDC can give you access to kind of help prepare you for the quiz. And then the quiz is open book. So you just have to complete, return that to them. And then I would highly, highly recommend once you've gotten access, consulting with your state public health lab to talk to them about their current process, how best to not step on their toes, and how to have them maybe share views with you or create views together so that you're not, again, stepping on their toes or getting in the way of any of their processes. Any questions about PulseNet 2.0 since we're on this section? Okay, feel free to use the Q&A if anyone happens to think of anything. I know I mentioned before that there are a number of other AMD resources out there for different pathogens. We really rely heavily on PulseNet and kind of the network of PulseNet labs and CDC for enterics, but the pathogen genomics centers of excellence are also available to help with various genomic, tasks and questions. And then our bioinformatics regional resource centers also do regular trainings and meetings and cover a number of different topics around AMD for different pathogens. There's a lot of focus on HAI and COVID in some of those programs. And then Lauren added several other resources, including some AMD contact lists that have been shared with states to the chat if you're interested in looking up more of these. So most of these resources have pretty limited focus on enterics. However, some of our pathogens that are not PulseNet pathogens, these may be good resources to look into for those or for folks who are in other program areas or have crossover with other program areas that do sequencing. All right, quick knowledge check. EPIs must have SAMS access and pay for a software license to access PulseNet 2.0. Just true or false? It looks like it's slowing down. So last chance. Okay. And y'all are correct. That is false. You do have to have SAMS access, but you do not have to pay for a software license. If anybody used bionumerics in the past, you did have to pay for a software license for that, but PulseNet 2.0 is a web-based platform. Okay, so now we're going to talk about communicating results for the rest of the time. And I want to start us off with a little bit of a discussion question. So please feel free in this piece to put responses in the chat. If you have a question, please put that in the Q&A, and I can read some of them, or we can kind of have a little bit of a discussion here. If you are willing to come off mute or want to, you may also choose to do that. But what communication challenges have you faced around genetic results during outbreak investigations or sequencing results? I can start while people are typing or thinking of typing, perhaps. I think we understand, as the EPIs who do this regularly, it's pretty easy to know what's happening because you know what's happening and not communicate out fully clearly or use jargon, and then have people sort of look at you blankly. So, really making sure that we are consistently and being prepared to communicate these results to people who don't work with them as frequently, even if they know what WGS is and how we use it, generally speaking. So some of our, regular outbreak partners, they're familiar enough, but they may not see this stuff all the time. So even with, somebody who knows a little bit, making sure that you are still taking the time to explain yourself clearly when interpreting the results. Now that's a good point, and I think that because some of these, because some of the work is a little siloed in the way that it has kind of developed, we also see a lot of different jargon between different programs that can be tricky to navigate. Yeah, absolutely, and it's kind of an ongoing process because I feel like you don't know until you've sort of done it poorly once, or run into a problem that you don't always realize that we gotta include this in our, how are we planning to communicate this information? Any other thoughts, challenges that you've faced, things people have said to you that made you realize that you maybe needed to communicate this information differently? Yeah, and kind of incorporating some of that explanation into some sort of, standard operating procedure or process. Yeah, good comment in the chat that, translating genomic data into actionable policy can be difficult, probably for, some of the same reasons mentioned. The interpretations can be different across different pathogens, across different types of analyses, and it can be really difficult to make that consistent enough to inform policy in a meaningful way. And it's a big time investment to have all of these people, not only doing the sequencing itself, but doing the bioinformatics and the interpretation work and the response work that goes along with it. Yeah, great Yeah, and I see a couple of other comments in the chat. So feel free to keep putting, some challenges in there. If there's anything in particular that you would like us to discuss, feel free to put that in the chat or put it in the Q&A and we can come back to it. So some of the big highlights here are seeing a lot of scientific jargons. We've already talked about that, and that jargon could be different by pathogen. It could be different by, program area, by test type, alleles versus SNPs versus, and the different thresholds. And there may be good reason that the jargon isn't consistent, but it still poses a challenge for how to communicate that information to a non-technical audience. One thing that isn't necessarily a result of the sequencing itself, but we see this with lab testing and communicating lab information during outbreaks more broadly, is that there can be quite a bit of time lag from isolate submission to sequencing and analysis. And in that intervening time, you may sometimes have enough to, maybe you can give a preliminary result, but maybe you can't, depending on what your, rules are. And so, making clear interpretations of the rest of your data while you're waiting for lab results, and then also being able to clearly communicate to, whoever, all partners involved, what could change depending on what the lab results, what end up being, so kind of that addressing, the changing information or changing messaging problem preemptively. We definitely see some issues with different access to data or to PHI, particularly when we have things like, traceback investigations nationally, trying to make sure that you're not oversharing information that shouldn't be shared, that's part of a 2088, or just that has maybe some identifiers, even if you're not using people's names or anything like that. Making sure that the level of information that's being shared is appropriate for the audience and does not disclose information that shouldn't be shared. And then I kind of, this is a broad category, but interpreting uncertainty, and we see this a lot with other pathogens too. These investigations have many components and moving pieces. They take a lot of time. It takes time to interpret the results, and sometimes information comes in that kind of contradicts itself or contradicts other pieces of information that you have, and how communicating to a non-technical audience, or particularly during an outbreak, how to interpret some of the uncertainty in the information that we get is probably one of our biggest challenges. So what are some of the ways that we can address these? With scientific jargon, using plain language as much as possible. There's a lot of good communication resources out there. I know some of the COEs have some, but even just, platforms like LinkedIn Learning or YouTube, frankly, have some really good plain language communication resources that you can use when, writing summaries or sharing results with a non-technical audience, or even with outbreak partners who maybe have some understanding but somewhat limited understanding. And then potentially developing those scripts ahead of time, or some sort of standard language to use across outbreak partners or external stakeholders, and with the understanding that is its own investment in time and effort. And you may have to develop a number of different resources or have them be different by different program areas and types of testing and things like that. But even just having some kind of standard language that you can start from is really helpful for decreasing the amount of jargon that is being communicated out. We also try to, to help with some of this, we also try to make sure that when we have our initial outbreak calls, or we're sending our cluster investigations to the region, that we have some language to kind of make sure everybody is on the same page early on in an investigation in terms of the, how are we interpreting this? Why have we used a particular threshold? What would change that potentially? And kind of setting expectations for setting expectations for how things might progress, but also making sure that everyone is sort of just in time, caught up to speed on all of our various WGS jargon that we use at the beginning of an investigation. So for for some of the communications challenges around kind of changing information, or lab results taking some time to come in, trying to, again, set some of those expectations early to all stakeholders, where possible, consulting with maybe your laboratory on the type of language that they might suggest using, phrases like preliminary results, knowing what you maybe can share verbally versus not ahead of time can really help. And then making sure that you are doing the interpretation. So not just presenting the other available, you may have epi information, you may have EH information in an investigation, not just presenting the results, but also making sure that you're interpreting what those mean for your audience, and conveying the strength of what those results mean regularly to your partners. So during an outbreak investigation, both to your internal partners, and then potentially, where appropriate, to maybe a restaurant owner or farm, whoever. And sometimes that might include things like sometimes that might include some information about what you've done to rule out other possible sources, or information about the general kind of investigation process, and that can help at least set the expectation that things may change as we get new information. Yeah. And sometimes it really depends on your audience, right? Sometimes that's important to convey, and other times maybe all they really need to know is this matches that. And so kind of having, being ready for sort of different levels of those conversations at different times. So potential solutions with people having, different access to data, or possibly, trying not to have calls that have 35 people on them every time you have an outbreak. A good way to deal with that can be sit reps that use standard language, including the interpretation of information and not just the presentation of information. And then, making sure that those sit reps don't share protected information, but do contain usable language if there's particular points of contact that maybe need to communicate updates to a firm, or something like that. So it also helps to have those points of contact. So we try to use, when we're talking to restaurants, we try to make sure that their routine inspector is involved in the investigation, and is able to be the one to communicate things with them, or be there at least when we're trying to communicate results or information to them, because we want that trusted point of contact with them. So then it is important to also then make sure that beforehand we have made sure that the inspector understands the data that we're looking at. So having kind of, like I said, multiple levels of this conversation to make sure that the information can be communicated clearly. Then lastly, with interpreting uncertainty, I think a big part of this in addressing this is reminding partners that lab data and WGS data is one piece of the evidence that we have, and it is really strongest with epi and environmental data in outbreaks. And so, making sure that you contextualize wherever you can, and then making sure to set those expectations around changing or evolving evidence throughout an investigation. So a scenario that can pose some challenges, and we're going to talk about two of them quickly. I know I'm running low on time here, but is that the sequence data suggests that some isolates are related to each other, but the epi and EH data is missing or does not align with an initial hypothesis. So sometimes that can be animal contact outbreaks. If you've got a stealth ingredient that's maybe implicated but hasn't been identified yet. Sometimes you might have environmental health data that is finding information that's not necessarily related to the implicated pathogen. And so this can kind of be a challenge you have to manage. So which of the following might best help address this challenge? Using plain language descriptions of why highly related sequencing data alone is a reliable link. Describing reasons epi or EH data could be biased or unreliable. Communicating next steps that could address these challenges, A and C, or all of the above. And I will say here that I am assuming that your audience has somewhere between 0 and maybe a little bit of knowledge about WGS. Most of you got it correctly who responded, A and C. So yeah, describing the reasons that some of your information is unreliable is not likely to be particularly helpful and could be more confusing than useful. So A and C. All right. So the flip side of that is our second scenario, where we maybe have no genetic relatedness, or maybe some unclear, wide range genetic relatedness with our samples, but we know that there is an epi link to a source. So sometimes this can happen with cyclo, when you have maybe testing or environmental sampling or food testing that was negative for the implicated pathogen. And some other examples here on the slide. But in this situation where maybe you have no WGS linkage or unclear WGS linkage, which of the following could help address this communication challenge the communication challenge this presents? Again, to an audience that has maybe between 0 and maybe a little bit of WGS and understanding. And if you can think of other things, feel free to put them in the chat. All right, most people responded A, which is the correct answer. We had some B responses explaining why specimens may cluster more loosely or not at all for some serotypes or transmission modes than others, which is not necessarily wrong. But if you are talking about an audience that has very little understanding, that explanation is probably more likely to confuse them than to create a clear, positive message about your investigation. Developing some standard language and communications before you need it, ideally, is helpful in addressing some of these challenges. I have some examples here on the slide that we can include in some of our resources of, a less detailed explanation versus a more detailed explanation to somebody with, pretty little technical knowledge about the process. And so having some of these discussions in advance or at the beginning of an outbreak investigation, can be useful. There are CDC and FDA outbreak notices and, some previous press releases and things that we've used for some of our standard language development that can be helpful. So using terms that people can readily find in other information is a great way to do that, or working with your comms office to try to do that. Obviously you'll have to educate your comms office about what some of this information means, but that can be helpful in itself. expectation setting, like I said, we usually try to make sure that at the beginning of an outbreak investigation, our internal partners, so our, local health department, our, local environmental health, folks like that know, understand what lab information we might be looking at as a starting point. So especially if we already have some WGS data, making sure we describe how we got that, what it means clearly in a way that they could then relay out to other people if needed. This is also a good time to share, to discuss some shared language that you can use with external parties in the investigation, around, kind of standard procedures or standard interpretations for things, or at least the way that you're interpreting your data for that particular investigation. And lastly, I know I already touched on this, so just knowing your audience and making sure that you are tailoring your language to that audience, with the knowledge that you may have to develop some standard language for different levels of audiences. We, just to kind of go back to that outbreak example that we used situation reports that had some of those visualizations in them. So our dendrogram, our epi curves, and the written interpretation that we shared with investigators on a weekly basis. We created that shared understanding and language early on, and then continued to reiterate it throughout the outbreak, on outbreak calls and in our written communications. We used our local, points of contact, our trusted experts, to be the ones to help communicate the information to the restaurant. And then we developed a final written report that included a clear interpretation of the results, not just presentation of the results, but interpretation in the discussion. And you don't have to read this whole long paragraph, but again, it can be one of the examples we send out with the resources. So I know we're a little over time, but I would be happy to take any questions if you have them. Oh, okay. I see one in the chat. Can you talk more about PulseNet 2.0 for local jurisdictions, logistics and overall utility? Labs pursuing getting PulseNet certified, and we're trying to decide whether we should request API access before the county lab is certified. So I'm assuming that you might be in a bigger county jurisdiction. If you already use, if you have access to Cedric, or you're already using SAMs and you've gotten people access to those things, it could be useful. Now, I will say I'm not sure if PulseNet is open to granting access for local jurisdictions. I think the access to state jurisdictions was, took a little bit of convincing. So, but I think that it could be worth the request, knowing that you're in a jurisdiction that has a large population, and that you may, frequently have your own clusters. Like if you have enough volume, that you have your own lab and that you are likely to be detecting your own clusters, I think the utility is there. And the process is not so challenging to get, epi access that it wouldn't be worth it. But if your volume isn't huge, and you're kind of readily able to get what you need from your state health department or something like that, then that would be a, reason to maybe consider sticking to that option. I hope that helps. If you don't have access to SAMs, that can be a challenge. That's a pretty significant barrier to entry. There's lots of forms, you have to get things notarized, all of that stuff. So that might be the more challenging barrier. And then if you once you have access to SAMs, getting access to PulseNet 2.0 or to Cedric is probably a little bit less of a lift.
So we talked about this last week, and I think someone mentioned that they had recently gotten access and you don't have to get things notarized anymore. So there may be some changes in how things are set up. So maybe a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Moved up her email address in the chat, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her directly, or you can use the Tennessee COE email address and they can guide the question to who it needs to go to. I hope this has been helpful for everyone, and we will hopefully see you at a Tennessee Food Safety Center of Excellence Community of Practice session and or a live learning series next year. Thanks.
Thanks.